What if the hands that claimed to help were the very hands that spied? What if the light of aid was just a mask for control? My brothers and my sisters, in the heart of Burkina Faso, a storm has begun to rise. 8 foreign aid workers, men and women who came carrying promises of relief and development, now stand accused of espionage. The streets of Ouagadougou are tense, the air thick with questions. And somewhere, behind closed doors, President Ibrahim Traoré is watching, silent but unbroken. This is not just another headline. This is a moment that shakes the very foundation of trust between Africa and the West. So stay with me, because this story, this truth, will not be told by those who fear it. Subscribe, my friends, if you believe Africa deserves to speak with her own voice, because tonight, we're not just talking about news, we're talking about Burkina Faso news that could change how the world sees us. They came at dawn, not with drums, not with banners, but with silence, the kind of silence that means something is about to change. Ouagadougou, the beating heart of Burkina Faso, woke to the echo of boots on the ground. The nation's security forces had moved, swiftly and quietly, to arrest 8 foreign aid workers, men and women who had long walked the dusty streets with clipboards and smiles, claiming to help rebuild what war and hunger had torn apart. But that morning, the smiles had vanished, and the people asked, aid workers or agents? The government statement came firm, sharp as thunder in dry season. 8 foreign nationals have been detained on suspicion of espionage and interference in national security operations. The names were not all revealed, but whispers filled the markets, the radio waves, the tea stalls. Some said they were tied to Western NGOs. Others believed they worked with intelligence outfits disguised under humanitarian labels. The truth, like a snake in tall grass, was still moving, unseen but dangerous. For years, the people had welcomed these organizations. They had watched white jeeps drive in with flags of compassion, bringing food, medicine, and promises. But somewhere, somehow, that trust began to rot. Reports had surfaced, strange movements near military zones, drones flying where none should. And when soldiers began to question, the answers were always the same. We are just here to help. But now the question echoed from the mouths of the people themselves. Help who? Help how? And at what cost? That day, the capital stood still. Mothers clutching radios, young men staring at the sky, elders whispering ancient prayers that had not been spoken since colonial times. Because they had seen this before, the moment when outsiders come smiling, but leave with secrets. And in the midst of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader whose rise had already unsettled the West. His silence that morning was not weakness, it was calculation. The same calm that comes before a storm. He had promised the nation one thing: no more interference, no more hidden hands. Burkina Faso will stand on her own feet. And for the first time in a long time, people believed him. They remembered the coups, the betrayals, the years of foreign dependence. They remembered how each aid mission came with new debts, new conditions, new chains disguised as gifts. And now, with 8 arrests, they felt something deeper, the stirring of dignity long buried under the dust of compromise. The Western embassies moved quickly. Statements of concern, demands for clarity, calls for immediate release. But on the streets, the people didn't chant for mercy. They chanted for truth. If they are innocent, let them prove it. If they are guilty, let them face justice, here in our land. The tension was heavy, but beneath it, a strange pride was growing. For the first time, Africa wasn't waiting for permission. She was acting. And the West was watching. Because this wasn't just about 8 people. It was about a continent beginning to say no. No to interference, no to invisible control, No to the idea that her children must always ask before they stand. The arrests shook the capital. But the truth? That would shake the world. But what did the investigation reveal about who they really were, and why the West began to panic? When the news broke, it didn't just echo through Burkina Faso. It thundered across oceans. In Washington, statements rolled out before the sun had risen. In Paris, headlines screamed, "Unacceptable detentions." In Brussels, diplomats whispered of concerns for regional stability. The message was clear. The West was shaken. 8 foreign aid workers, their people, now under lock and key in the land of a man they called unpredictable. But my brothers and sisters, the question we must ask is this: why such fear if there was nothing to hide? For years, they had treated Africa as a patient on life support, always in need, always dependent, always grateful. But now, one young captain had cut the cord, and his name, Ibrahim Traoré, was on every tongue, in every embassy, in every whispered strategy call. As protests flickered in the streets of Ouagadougou, something else began to rise. A chant, a rhythm, a pulse of defiance. Africa is not your playground. No more puppets, no more masters. And the people lifted their heads. For once, they were not ashamed. For once, they stood tall in their own dust. Then, 3 days after the arrests, Traoré spoke, not in apology, not in fear, but with the fire of a man who knows his ancestors are listening. He stood before the cameras, eyes steady, uniform pressed, voice like iron striking stone. They call it aid, but we call it control. They say they come to help, but their help has always come with strings. We are not children. We are a sovereign people, and we will no longer bow. That line, they call it aid, but we call it control, burned through the airwaves like a spark in dry grass. It reached Mali, Niger, Guinea, Ghana, the hearts of those who had long felt the same, but dared not say it aloud. Western journalists tried to frame him as a radical. Western leaders called him dangerous. But the people? The people called him son of Sankara. And that, my friends, is where the storm became a movement. Behind closed doors, the Western envoys demanded immediate clarification. Their tone was polite, but their fear was visible. Burkina Faso, a small, poor country, how could she dare defy the mighty hands that once fed her? But Traoré didn't blink. He didn't bow. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he ordered a full review of all foreign NGOs operating within the nation. Every permit, every mission, every coin that entered the country would now be audited. He said, "If you came here with clean hands, you have nothing to fear. But if you came to sow division, your time is over." And the people roared. For the first time, they saw power not borrowed, but born. In Europe, media outlets began to run stories. Burkina Faso sliding into isolation. Traoré's paranoia risks stability. But deep inside the continent, elders whispered, "He speaks the truth they tried to silence." Because you see, the storm that the West feared most wasn't in Burkina Faso. It was in the hearts of Africans, the awakening, the question, the courage to say no more. That was the real threat. This was not merely a diplomatic crisis. It was a spiritual confrontation between a people reclaiming their soul and a world terrified of losing its control. And as the dust settled over the capital, a strange calm followed. Burkina Faso had crossed a line, one that could not be uncrossed. The West called it dangerous. The people called it freedom. Yet behind closed doors, whispers began to spread. Was this just the beginning of a purge or the birth of a new Africa? The storm had passed, but the air was still electric. In Ouagadougou, the tension gave way to quiet conversations in markets, mosques, and under the shade of neem trees. The people had seen something that would not be forgotten. a nation daring to say no, not in secret, but in daylight. And from that daylight, ripples began to spread. In Mali, leaders called emergency meetings. In Niger, officers whispered that maybe, just maybe, they too could walk the same path. And in Senegal, Ghana, and Chad, youth on social media began to share Traoré's words. They call it aid, but we call it control. It wasn't just a quote, it was a mirror reflecting decades of dependency, of borrowed dreams and foreign hands stirring African destinies. But brothers and sisters, every awakening comes with a cost. Within days, Western donors began to suspend funding. Projects in education, health, and food relief were suddenly under review. Some offices of foreign NGOs quietly shut their doors, others packed up overnight and vanished, leaving half-built schools and empty clinics behind. And the people began to ask the question no one wanted to ask. If their aid was truly for us, why did it stop so fast? The silence that followed was more painful than the loss itself. Because in that silence, truth began to echo. For years, Africa had trusted, believing that development must come from outside. But now they saw what help looked like when the helper was offended. They saw how fragile their systems had become, how deeply the roots of dependency had dug into their soil. It was a bitter realization, but also a sacred one. In the rural north, elders gathered and spoke of the old ways, of farming without foreign seed, of trading without foreign permission, of healing without imported medicine. They remembered a time when Africa's strength was not measured in dollars, but in dignity. Young people listened. And for the first time, they didn't laugh. Something deep within them, something their ancestors had buried to survive, began to rise again. Not hatred, not revenge, but memory. The memory of self-reliance, the memory of freedom. Of course, not everyone was at peace. Civil servants worried about lost salaries. Business owners feared losing contracts with European partners. Mothers wondered how to feed their children without aid. And in those moments, even the most loyal supporters of the new government asked themselves, "Are we ready to stand alone?" That question haunted the streets like a ghost of past centuries. Yet amid the fear, there was something undeniable, a spark of pride. Because for once, Burkina Faso was not bending. For once, Africa was not apologizing for wanting to own her future. Across the continent, the Africa for Africans movement began to trend. From Nairobi to Lagos, from Accra to Bamako, voices rose. Let us build our own aid. Let us write our own story. And even in the West, some began to listen. Some journalists, some thinkers, even some ordinary citizens started to ask, what if Traoré is not the villain, but the messenger? That, my friends, is the real power of truth. You can silence a man, but not an idea. And so, as the days turned to weeks, the ripples became waves. Mali began expelling foreign forces. Niger followed. And together they formed a new alliance, not of conquest, but of sovereignty. They called it the Sahel Coalition of Dignity. And though the world mocked it as fragile, the people believed it as faith. Because faith, not power, is what built nations before. The events in Burkina Faso were no longer a story of 8 arrests. They had become a symbol, a line drawn in the sand between submission and self-respect. The West had underestimated one thing. Not Traoré's army, not his weapons, but the fire that burns in a people who finally see themselves. But could this new path bring unity or unleash chaos across a fragile continent? Do you believe this is Africa's rebirth, or just another storm that will fade when the world looks away? When Washington speaks, the world listens. But this time, when Washington spoke, Africa listened back. The State Department released its usual words: deep concern, urgent clarification, respect for international norms. But behind those polished phrases was a tremor, a quiet fear. Because for the first time, the call for transparency wasn't coming from the West. It was being demanded of them. Burkina Faso had dared to look the world's power in the eye and say, "You don't own our truth." In Paris, the fear was deeper, older, almost ancestral. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, once the jewels of France's colonial empire, were slipping away like sand between trembling fingers. The Élysée Palace called emergency meetings. French newspapers warned of a dangerous anti-Western trend in Africa. And yet, on the streets of Paris, young Africans in the diaspora marched, raising flags of red, green, and gold, chanting, "Leave our lands, leave our people. Africa will rise without you." France, once the master of influence, now watched as her children walked away. And every step they took echoed centuries of unspoken pain. In the United States, analysts on cable networks tried to simplify what they could not understand. Traoré is aligning with Russia. Burkina Faso risks isolation. Democracy under threat. But few asked the real question. Why do African nations feel safer with their own destiny than under Western protection? Because, my brothers and sisters, that question cuts too deep. It touches the empire's nerve, the truth that control has always been wrapped in the cloth of assistance. They called it partnership, but the hands were never equal. They called it democracy, but they chose the winners. And now, as Africa began to stand upright, they called it rebellion. The irony was bitter. The same nations that once preached liberty now trembled before the sight of African freedom. The same governments that lectured on transparency had built decades of hidden deals, quiet coups, and silent manipulation. And now, Ibrahim Traoré, with his calm defiance and unshakable words, had pulled the curtain aside. He had spoken the unspeakable. He had forced the world to look into the mirror. "When the lion roars," he said in one of his speeches, "the hunters tremble, not because the lion is violent, but because he remembers who he is." That, my friends, was the moment the world understood. This was no longer just Burkina Faso news. This was a reckoning. And in the halls of Washington and Paris, they whispered, "What if this spirit spreads?" Because the fear was not about one man or one country. The fear was about a continent remembering its power. And so the question remained, who really fears the rise of Africa? The world that ruled her, or the world she's about to lead? The night has been long, brothers and sisters, long with the weight of centuries, with the shadow of colonization, with the noise of promises that never fed the hungry nor freed the bound. But as the dawn breaks over Ouagadougou, a new light rises, not from the west, but from within. It is the light of self-belief, the fire of sovereignty, the whisper that says, "We can build our own tomorrow." In the capital, soldiers stand guard not for a foreign flag, but for their own soil. Farmers till their land with renewed pride. Students talk of innovation, not immigration. And young voices, the generation that once looked to Paris or Washington, now look to Ibrahim Traoré and say, "Teach us how to stand." Because they see in him not just a soldier, but a mirror. A reflection of what courage looks like when the world tells you to kneel. Across Africa, something is moving, a quiet, steady pulse. From Niamey to Bamako, from Accra to Addis Ababa, people are speaking the same prayer. Africa must stand for Africa. And this prayer is not against the world. It is for ourselves. It is not hatred. It is healing. It is not rebellion. It is resurrection. For generations we were told we could not. Now we say, we will. Traoré's message, the spirit behind the Ibrahim Traoré speech, is echoing through the Sahel and beyond. We will build, even with bare hands. We will protect, even with empty pockets. For freedom, once awakened, does not sleep again. And my brothers and sisters, this is what frightens the powerful. Not the guns, not the speeches, but the awakening of a continent that remembers who she is. Yes, the road ahead will be hard. There will be hunger before there is harvest, doubt before belief, and pain before peace. But every nation that rose from the ashes of domination walked through that same fire. And Africa, our Africa, is no different. The West may turn its back. But for once, we will not fall, because we have learned to stand on our own. This is not the end of Burkina Faso news. This is the beginning of Africa's new story, written not in the language of charity, but in the rhythm of freedom. The world is watching, but this time, Africa is writing its own script. My brothers and sisters, this is not just a story about 8 arrests. It is not just Burkina Faso news. It is the sound of a continent remembering her heartbeat. For too long, Africa's story has been told by strangers, written in foreign ink, spoken in borrowed tongues. But now, in the land of Burkina Faso, a new voice has risen. A voice that refuses to whisper. A voice that says, no more chains, no more lies, no more fear. Ibrahim Traoré once said, in what the world now calls the Ibrahim Traoré speech, we are not poor. We are rich with courage, with land, with people. But we have been taught to doubt our own gold. And that, my friends, is the truth that terrifies empires. Because when Africa begins to see her own value, the world's balance shifts. When a nation stands without asking, the masters lose their throne. This is not the end of the road. It is the beginning of a long, painful, glorious march. There will be storms, oh yes, and the old powers will fight to keep control. But every step we take, every voice that rises, every heart that dares to dream of freedom, adds another stone to the bridge between who we were and who we are becoming. So I ask you, not as a journalist, not as a preacher, but as your brother. Do you feel it? That stirring in your chest, that pride you can't explain? That is the sound of Africa waking up. If you feel it too, don't let it fade. Subscribe, share this story, speak it aloud, because our story, our truth, must be told by us. This isn't just Burkina Faso news anymore. It is the prophecy of a continent that refuses to be silent. The world is watching, but this time Africa is not waiting for permission. She is writing her own future, in her own language, on her own terms. And one day, when history looks back, they will not say Burkina Faso rebelled. They will say Africa remembered.